the beheading of a Yosemite Park worker. As the FBI looks into other homicides in the national park, the suspect's arrest resurrects a tragic story of a kidnapped boy.
This is Burden of Proof with Roger Cossack and Greta van-susteren.
Hello, welcome to Burden of Proof. Roger is off today. A motel handyman who was once questioned and then ruled out as a suspect in the murders of 3 Yosemite Park tourists has been arrested in the killing of a 26-year-old naturalist at the park. Cary Stayner was arrested on Saturday, and the FBI has now linked him to those 3 initial homicides. Investigators are now asking themselves if the most recent murder could have been avoided.
I've asked myself whether we could have done anything differently that might have prevented the murder of Joey Armstrong. I've struggled with that issue for the last 24 hours and continue to do so. Nevertheless, I consider the resources that have been brought to bear on these cases, the dedication of the men and women on the task force, the quality of the information we've received from a wide variety of sources, and the extraordinary efforts taken to conceal and destroy evidence. I'm confident that we have done everything that reasonably could have been done.
In a bizarre twist in this case, the suspect is the brother of a boy whose story of being kidnapped shocked the nation 2 decades ago. Stephen Stayner was reunited with his family in 1980 after spending 7 years in the hands of his abductor. He was killed 10 years ago by a hit-and-run driver. Joining us here in Washington today are Indenisaria Meekins, former federal prosecutor Pam Stewart, and former FBI agent Pete Smerick. In our back row, David Reitz, Alexandra Lawrence, and Karanja Augustine. And also joining us from Sacramento, California, is CNN correspondent Don Knapp. Don, why was Cary Stayner arrested?
The FBI is not saying what connects these 4 killings. We do know that he was questioned, as you indicated, back in February or March of this year with the deaths of those 3 sightseers and released. And actually, I recall last week when the first announcements of this came out, the FBI was answering questions from reporters saying, no, we don't think there's any connection between the murder of Joey Armstrong and the Pelosso murders earlier this year.
All right, well, let's talk first about the homicide of Joey Armstrong. Who was she? Where was she found? What was she doing in the park?
Joey Armstrong worked for a private organization, the Yosemite Institute, and she worked in Yosemite National Park as a naturalist. She lived in an area of Foresta, which we know about from forest fire stories we've covered there. Foresta is a piece of land that was privately owned but grandfathered into the boundaries of Yosemite National Park, and it's turned out to be sort of a residential area for a lot of people who work in the park or work around the park. She was near this area when her body was found decapitated on Thursday.
Now, were any weapons found, or the manner of the homicide? Did they find anything near her body indicate how the crime was committed?
We have no evidence. The FBI is not saying how she was murdered or how the other folks were murdered earlier this year.
Now, where was it that Cary Stayner was actually arrested? Was he arrested near the body or in a time in close proximity to the homicide?
No, actually he was arrested in a small town not far from Sacramento at a nudist colony. Apparently he was staying at a nudist colony. He had used his driver's license there, which was a requirement of the nudist colony to check in. It was kind of a camping place. Apparently when he was arrested, he was not nude. He was dressed in fatigues, and he apparently surrendered with no resistance.
Now, was he a regular in this nudist colony so that they were familiar with him?
The talk is, the reports are that he had been there before. I don't know how frequently, but he had been there before, yes.
Now, he worked at some point at the Cedar Lodge. What is the significance of the Cedar Lodge?
That's what ties all of this together. The Cedar Lodge on February 15th is the last place that Julie's son, her mother Carol's son, and her friend from Argentina, Silvina Pelosso, were last seen alive. And of course, this is where Cary Stayner worked. He worked at that Cedar Lodge, and he actually lived in a room above the kitchen at the lodge there.
Was he working at the Cedar Lodge at the time that this last homicide occurred?
He was actually apparently not working that very day, but he does live there, and apparently had meals at the restaurant there.
Now, is there any evidence or any information to indicate that Joey Ruth Armstrong, the most recent homicide victim, knew him at all?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your last question.
Is there any information to suggest that Joey Ruth Armstrong would have had any connection or that she knows Cary Stayner?
We have no information on that so far, and we don't understand. The FBI is not saying what connects all of this.
Do we know how far is the place of his employment, which was at the Cedar Lodge, from the location of the homicide?
There are two roads that come into Yosemite National Park. One is Highway 120, which just drops you down into Yosemite Valley, and the other highway is, I believe, 140 that goes to out the other side to Modesto. And near 120 is where Foresta was, and that's where Joey Armstrong's body was found. Highway 140, this other main entrance to the park, is where the Cedar Lodge is. And the distance, the actual physical distance, may be 4, 5, or 6 miles. That's just a rough guess.
Pete, what is the FBI doing right now? What do they do to investigate this case? We've got the earlier 3 homicides from earlier in the spring, and now we have this most recent 26-year-old who was beheaded. What does the FBI do?
In a situation like this, where we're called in to assist other investigators in the investigation of a homicide, a task force is going to be formed. And that task force is going to consist of experienced investigators and agents, evidence technicians, photographers, computer experts. And there's going to be a coordinated investigation and also crime scene search. A part of the investigation, of course, is going to be the interviewing of perhaps hundreds or thousands of individuals for any information that might be of value to the investigators.
Don, is somebody in custody right now in connection with the earlier triple homicide?
There were a number of people in jail. The FBI never named them definitely as suspects. They only said, and we all had the indication, in fact, everybody in Northern California had pretty much assumed that that case was all wrapped up because FBI had said that everybody associated with that case was in custody on unrelated charges and had said specifically that there was no one else that they felt related to the case that was loose.
Pam, what does a prosecutor do now? We've got some people in custody who apparently everyone thought had sort of wrap up the earlier triple homicide. Now they have someone who's arrested they think may be involved. What does a prosecutor do?
Well, I'm assuming that the people who were previously in custody were in there on unrelated charges. So probably the prosecutor does nothing specific in terms of dismissing any holds or anything on those earlier people. The focus is going to be on Mr. Stayner and what evidence links those two events, the earlier 3 homicides and this current one.
All right, we need to take a break. Thanks to Don Knapp for joining us from Sacramento. And up next, how federal agents are attempting to link Cary Stayner to other homicides in Yosemite National Park. Stay with us.
Very good, sir.
Good.
The A-Team.
Stayner's arrest, we believe that no other person involved in any of these murders is still on the loose. The possible involvement of other individuals, aside from Stayner, in the Sund-Pelosso case is still being evaluated.
After arresting suspect Cary Stayner in the beheading of a Yosemite Park employee, investigators started looking into his possible involvement in another series of homicides at the park. Carole's son, her daughter Julie, and family friend Silvina Pelosso were last seen alive at a lodge where Stayner had worked. He had been laid off in January but was rehired in March, one day after two of the victims' bodies were found in the trunk of their rental car. Joining us now from Sacramento is Mareva Brown of the Sacramento Bee newspaper. Mareva, take me back to the when they found the son's body. Did they actually back up even a little bit further? Was Mr. Stayner questioned in connection with the murder of the sons and their young friend?
He was. He was one of dozens, maybe hundreds of people who were questioned who lived in the area of El Portal. It's still unclear whether he was living at Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment during that time, because he wasn't working at the lodge at that time. But he may have been there. He certainly visited the restaurant a lot, and he was one of the people that the FBI questioned. But they said yesterday that he didn't really show up on their radar screen as somebody they wanted to look more closely at.
Why did they even question him to begin with? It was merely because he worked at the lodge where the victims had stayed?
We don't know. They didn't say that. Certainly the impression that we got is that he was one of a number of people that they interviewed routinely just because he was in the area.
Pete, that seems like, the FBI is probably going to take, considerable amount of criticism if it turns out that he committed this earlier homicide as well as the more recent one, the beheading the other day. What happens that the FBI would have this problem if indeed it turns out this way?
Well, remember, when the investigation begins, it starts at the crime scene. And then you start interviewing people who are closest to the crime scene, and you start working out from that particular parameter. When he was interviewed, agents are trained to analyze a person's verbal responses to their questions, along with the nonverbal responses. And what we're looking for are those behavioral clues that shows that an individual is deceitful, is being deceptive, or feels uncomfortable with the questions that are being asked of him. Now, during the interview, if he did not display any of those clues that we're looking for as agents, and then coupled with the investigation of his background, nothing surfaced indicating he had a violent past or even violent tendencies, he would not be completely cleared as a suspect, but he would be put on, say, the B list. In other words, we're not going to completely exonerate him at this time, but we have so many other suspects to be looking for and interviewing, let's just keep him on a back burner. And apparently what has happened now, because of the coordinated effort of the FBI investigation, when the second crime occurred, all of this information came together, and now he rises to the surface again as a suspect in this case.
Mareva, do we know whether or not the victims in the triple homicide were beheaded, if it was the same manner of homicide that this recent victim died from?
We don't know. The FBI has not released any information about the condition of the bodies of the two sons and Silvina Pelosso, except that the bodies in the trunk were burned. So we don't have any information about how they died or what other trauma was inflicted to the bodies.
Pam, if you were the prosecutor, what would you be looking at now in drawing the comparison between the triple homicide and the new homicide, assuming, and we simply don't know at this point, assuming there's any connection and whether they even committed these homicides?
Well, we assume, of course, that the FBI had probable cause for the arrest, so there's some probably physical evidence that links Mr. Stayner to either the crime scene or the murder weapon in this second murder that somehow is linked up, probably through physical evidence, with the earlier murders. Now, it may be that the autopsy reports from the earlier murders do indicate that they occurred perhaps by stabbing, because to behead somebody, you've got to have some sort of a sharp object, probably a knife. And it may be that they have recovered a knife with fingerprints linked to Mr. Stayner or some other evidence that somehow links these two events.
Mareva, why did they arrest Mr. Stayner? What was it that drew their attention to him in connection with the most recent homicide?
They have been very vague about that. We know that they questioned him Thursday night after Joey's body was found at about 1 o'clock on Thursday. That evening they contacted him near the Merced River, They questioned him, the FBI did, and then they let him go. And then a short time later, certainly within the next 12 to 24 hours, they issued an all-points bulletin for him. But what that link was, they're not saying at this point.
What about, I mean, why did they question him so soon? What was it that drew their attention to him? She was murdered on Thursday, or her body was found on Thursday, and he was questioned a few hours later. There must have been something that pointed in his direction, whether or not he did it or didn't do it.
It would be great to know that. They have said that they don't believe that the two of them knew each other, or at least that she knew him, but they won't say what it was that led them to him on Thursday. We don't know.
Pam, today everyone's saying that he's going to be arraigned, but it's probably something called a presentment. Is that right? Not really an arraignment? What's a presentment for the benefit of our viewers?
All right, a presentment is like an arraignment, but it is the first appearance of somebody in court who has been arrested but not yet formally charged by way of indictment. At a presentment, he'll be advised of the charges against him. No plea will be entered because there is no formal indictment at this point.
And it'll go to a grand jury to see whether ultimately a grand jury does indict, then there'll be an arraignment, but we need to take a break. Other people have been investigated for potential roles in the Yosemite murders. Find out if police will rule those possible suspects out or tie them to Stayner when we come back.
That script for me? So Lisa, you there? Is anybody there? What is this new tease protocol? What is that? Like 2 minutes earlier? Or? Okay. Okay.
Hello, I'm Lou Waters. Next in the news, Yosemite murder suspect Cary Stayner is the brother of Stephen Stayner, kidnapped at age 7, stayed missing for 7 years, then died tragically. They made a movie about him. The Stayner story is next. CNN Today begins right after Burden of Proof.
Cary Stayner was taken into custody Saturday morning at a California nudist colony after being suspected of murdering 26-year-old Joey Ruth Armstrong. Mareva, you had a chance to speak to the Stayner mother. Can you tell us what she said and also give us a little history of Cary's brother Stephen?
Sure. Cary's mother, Kay, said that they were just coping the best that they could at that point. Initially, Cary was reported as a missing person, so for her, the thought was, you know, one child had been missing and now this child is missing. And she didn't want to talk much, obviously. She didn't want to talk much at all once he had been detained and arrested for Joey's murder. Cary is the second eldest of 5 children, and his younger brother Stephen was abducted when he was 7 in 1972 and by a child molester and sexually abused for about 7.5 years before he escaped. He was living in Ukiah with the child molester under the child molester's last name, and he escaped after the suspect, the child molester, abducted another little boy, and he said he didn't want that boy to go through what he'd been going through, and he took that child and left, and he was reunited with his family a short time later.
Pete, it seems like one of the most bizarre kidnapping stories to have a young boy kidnapped, Stephen Stayner, kept for 7 years and then released. In all your experience with the FBI, you ever seen anything like that, an abduction for 7 years?
There have been a number of cases like that where an individual has been kidnapped, either a child or actually women have been kidnapped and kept for a period of time. And in the case of women, the offender normally tries to create a sexual slave type of scenario or situation where after a period of time she is so fearful of her life being taken that he can do anything he wants with her knowing she's not going to be able to flee. And with a youngster, once again, you have somebody who's very controllable, very malleable, and for many, many years this offender was able to convince him that his parents didn't care about him, they weren't concerned about him, and I, in fact, am your benefactor. And I think, as I remember correctly, it was only after this individual, the pedophile, brought in another young boy into the equation that this young man was able to break free from it.
Mareva, how many years difference between Stephen Stayner and Cary Stayner, and after Stephen came home to the family, did they have any relationship of any sort?
Stephen was the next child in line behind Cary. I'm not sure exactly how far apart they are in age. And we know just from news articles at the time of Stephen's death, Stephen died in a motorcycle accident 10 years ago, that all the siblings were very close, and that, you know, the relationship between Stephen and his family, you know, was able to be whole again. When Stephen died, he left behind a wife and 2 young children, and they also were very close with Stephen's siblings. So this apparently comes as kind of a surprise to those who knew the family.
Does Cary Stayner, if you know, does Cary Stayner, who's the one who is now accused of this recent homicide, does he have any sort of criminal record?
That is unclear. He doesn't apparently, from what we know anyway, have any major felony convictions. Whether he has other arrests or whether he has other minor convictions is still something that we're checking out.
Pam, you know, prosecutors now got to think whether or not there might be some other cases out there that, assuming that Cary Stayner does have some involvement in these crimes. What does a prosecutor do?
Well, at the present time, they're worried about putting together their cases involving the Armstrong murder and the other 3 involving the sons and their friend from Argentina. But it's probably going to fall to the FBI to look through the entire history of this man's life and find out where he might have been, where there were very bizarre killings, such as the ones that we're talking about today, because there may be some unsolved murders out there that he may have committed.
And Pete, you know, Pam makes the point that whether the bizarre murders, I mean, obviously the one recently with the beheading is certainly would I assume would be classified as bizarre, but we don't know yet about whether or not there are any other homicides involved with the other ones. But what would you be doing as the FBI at this point?
Well, if I was still with the FBI as a criminal profiler, I'd been relying on the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a computer system that we have down at the FBI Academy that enables our analysts to link together unsolved crimes from around the country.
And to see whether or not there may be something more to this. But of course, it's so early in the investigation. But that's all the time we have for now. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for watching. Join us again next time for another edition of Burden of Proof. We'll see you then.